Well, good morning, good morning. We are here with Jack. Say hello, Jack.
Say hello, audience. Back in the early days of racing, technology wasn't there. There was a lot of trial and effort, and get it done again, get done again and again. So there were lots of failures of items and pieces. Nowadays, you look at a 24-hour race, and the cars are running as strong as they were in qualifying. At the end of 24 hours, they're within seconds of each other. Stuff like this just doesn't happen often.
That $2 part that puts you out of the race.
So it's kind of a thought that we had of broken parts and broken hearts of racing. And I thought I'd make a little display here of what happened in the old days, and you just kind of accept it as, well, that's racing.
Yeah.
And little by little, as technology was getting into the game, they started worrying about weight. Here's an example of a nice, I don't know how much they cost, but it was aluminum main caps for your crankshaft bearings. And of course, that didn't want to stay happy together, and it broke. That wouldn't happen in today's technology, but it happened back then, and you just kind of say, oh hell, and accept it as a problem. Along those lines, here's an example that I bumped into. Basically, I was always a one-man show, or at the most two, and I would have to rebuild the motors, get them into the car, get them on a trailer in time to leave and drive 12 hours to a track somewhere. So everything was last minute. And I was assembling an engine, a 427 or a 454 probably, Chevy V8. And the connecting rod bolts out of GM, high quality, individually wrapped in our little packages, special order from the factory and all that at the dealer. So now I'm grabbing the bag, turning the bag over, slipping the bolts in, putting the caps on, trying to get done as fast as I can. And I get this one bolt, I put it in, I couldn't get the threads to start. And I looked around, I finally decided to look at it. Well, that's because there's no threads on it. Now, how did that get through all of GM's pre-looking and testing and wrapping and inspections and all that, and nobody noticed there's no threads on it? That wouldn't happen nowadays.
No.
And then the other end of a lot of early days, and even today, they thought that less weight. The car wants to be less weight. Every ounce counts. To the point where they'll do things like this. These two bolts, this size bolt, is on a GTP cars where the bicycle frame, we call it, the framework attaches to the cockpit. And these are the two key bolts that go in and hold the whole world together. But some people felt they had to drill them out for weight. So I got one that wasn't drilled, and I weighed it. It weighed 154 grams. The one with the hole weighed 118 grams. So that's a savings of 36 grams of weight. Oh, that certainly would make it a winning car. Grasping at straws. Along those lines, in one of our races, it was a hot day like it is today. And I wasn't in the best of moods. And in order to make things ready and get to the track in time, it was last minute on everything. And I made a little bracket, no bigger than that, to hold something on the cowl. Come on, fly. And I made it out of angle iron that was laid around the shop. And one of the drivers says, why did you make it out of aluminum? And I said, because I didn't have any, and I had to be putting the car in the trailer in a matter of minutes and hours, so whatever was available. my favorite comment of the days were function first, cosmetic second. And I said, by the way, how much do you weigh? And looked at the other driver and said, how much do you weigh? And how much does a gallon of gas weigh? And I looked at the driver that's complaining about every ounce counts. And he says, between you in the car with an empty fuel tank and the other guy in the car with a full fuel tank was 220 pounds difference. You should have been flying. Your pit. He immediately left the pits and was going faster than you. So don't give me this bullshit about every ounce counting. If you can get every ounce of performance, then it counts. He never forgave me for that. But that's the bottom line anymore. The technology has caught up with so many items, and then you worry about what does break and why. We were discussing why this broke, and you can see that when they cut a spline, obviously the cutter is cutting nice straight cuts. At the root of each spline is the smallest diameter, and being a sharp cutter, they are the stress points that start. And you can see that as this had progressed back and forth, this preso obviously was up in here, standing there as one item, and little by little, that broke off. This was the steering column on a Ferrari. So it posed the question of how much torque does a steering wheel apply to the shaft? And everybody says, well, in cornering and this and that. And I said, no, it's when you're trying to steer it in the garage on a flat, dry surface and not rolling 1 inch. Everybody's done it. They grab that wheel and, Well, this happened as I was backing Oscar Kowaleski's Ferrari off the trailer after a race. And to get it aligned better with the trailer ramps, I pulled on the wheel and it spun around nicely. So how lucky was that? On the next lap, Oscar would have been into the trees somewhere. But that's fatigue, that's pure metal fatigue. And other than a magnafluxing, possibly you might pick up the crack, but at that point in life, the crack started in the middle and it's worked itself. In early days, there were lots of people that would have things x-rayed first. So that's the problem with a lot of these parts and pieces that broke, which is simply the matter of technology not being available. That same Ferrari had a De Dion rear suspension, but no center section. And back in those days, it was pre-Stingray, Corvette Stingray, so we had no availability of a center section for power to put into that car. I took a standard Impala 12-volt live axle, cut the ends off, brought the wheel bearings in as close as I could to the ring and pinion, and then had the shafts cut down and re-splined. And obviously we maybe didn't get into repenetrating or heat treating, but that's the kind of torque that Oscar was throwing into the new rubber, trying to twist that guy off. And often that happened often. This was the input shaft out of the clutch at Lime Rock with the Camaro. Paul Miller had Kepler Miller driving. They said, I could put it in any gear, let the clutch out, there's no drive. The input or output shaft out of the tranny into the crankshaft actually twisted that guy right off. That wouldn't happen nowadays, but it was all the technology of the day. And when you're a little team, you don't make your own shafts, you just buy what's available. A lot of that happened. This is a BMW Daytona 1981, about 13 hours into the race. And the driver calls in, there was a little explosion and a flash of flame in the rear, that this was a BMW M1. He said, I hit the fire bottle, the fire went out, but now it won't start, so I must have burnt a wire. So I gave the radio to the other driver, and I started gathering up some wiring type things to go out to the car to see if I can get it running. And the other driver was asking more and more questions until he finally had to kind of scream out, "You blew the motor." Well, it wasn't a connecting rod wristband. The other end of the rod spun around on the crankshaft yet and hadn't scored the bearings yet. So obviously it was a rod failure. But now this guy of the rod was swinging around and around and around. It literally cut the oil pan in half. It literally was breaking out the sides of the block. This is a driver that didn't have a good aptitude of, what's that funny noise? And if you want to take a second or so, I can bring out the oil pan and show you the results of that. Break time.
So, while Jack's getting that, yes, that is an original 427 Cobra, not a kit. There's a BMW M1 Jack's working on at the moment, and that is quietly awaiting parts as usual. A little panning of the shop. That noise is that fan. Yes, it weighs 50,000 pounds. It's probably from 1956, yes. There's Jack. And here's the oil pan. There you have it.
My friends at BMW wanted me to burn this, but it's had such a nice story behind it. I couldn't do that. So I retained it. But that's what happened when the connecting rod just kept going around and around and around.
Oof.
Probably developed a little oil leak too.
Oh, just a little. Just a little.
What else is of interest in the breaking of parts? At any racetrack, the people that support the race, the corner workers, the tow truck drivers, when you have to be towed in, they're not real race fans. They're there to do a job. They don't watch the race that closely. They're always busy. So if your car that you're with is off the road and has to be towed back, I advise any crew member for that car to go with the truck driver, because they don't know the structure of every car they have to work on and tow on. This piece of tubing here obviously should be over here on both ends. And when the car went off into the dirt, it had to be towed back all out of the track. And the tow driver looking around, where does he grab? He says, oh, that looks like a good piece of suspension. He throws the hook on it, pulls it off, and that's a McLaren M8F suspension link from the out to the upright. Piece of aluminum that thin. That thin. By the time you turn it down and run the threads, what's the wall thickness of that? And that was a suspension item on a solid piece of aluminum at the beginning. It could have been a 1/4-inch hole.
Yeah.
This bit of down to the last gram in a race car is ridiculous in my life. Even today's Formula One cars, the slightest bump in a fence or something, and the car disintegrates, pieces and parts all over the place. There's places to add weight, there's places to take weight off. And that's the part of the problem. Then there's a dumb mechanic that's in a hurry trying to get an engine reassembled on either the M1 or the CSL, I'm not sure which now, but the air box for the cool air is held on with 1032 little screws, and they're kind of awkward to get at. And they go into a safety nut, captured nut. So I said, well, it'll be all right. I don't have to safety wire the ones way back in the hole. Well, maybe I should have, because the bolt that came loose, you can see it there. It did get loose. It did came out, and of course, being small, it bounced around quite a bit, and eventually got out through the exhaust valve. Didn't stop the engine from running, but it's still, oh shit of the day. That was 100% my fault. The other problem with that kind of game is this one, or is it this one? Which one now, Jack? I got enough to worry about here. No, maybe it's... Okay. This was 1971, Road Atlanta. Tony Adamowitz in a Can-Am car. The pockets in the top of the piston for valve clearance have to be machined so that the valve obviously doesn't hit. And in the machining of that, it goes down there pretty deep, and the land for the ring, very, very, very thin area of the piston affecting to the heat. Well, the end gap of the top compression ring is always getting that kind of motion, up and down, up and down. And it happened to be right at that point as it rotated, and it finally broke the piston at that point. So that little pieces of the piston were coming out, and the connecting, or the upper compression ring was going more and more and more. It finished the race, but obviously was burning a lot of oil. Again, the technologies of the day, that wouldn't have happened today. Lots of stories, broken hearts and broken parts. That obviously was a valve that broke off and tried like hell to get out of the engine. That was Mario Andretti's 2-liter Alpha. He has it in, it's a 1975 inboard hydroplane, Formula One hydroplane. And the life of those motors is flat on the floor constantly. After I had rebuilt the motor, he ran it, and John Andretti drove it a while around the lake nearby home here. And he said, oh, it's getting 300 RPM more than it ever did with that prop. So that's apparently how they gauge power output. They use the same prop, water as consistency. So if they can get more RPMs, they know it's a good motor. Well, it lasted 2 years before the valve says, I quit. The hot rod item had a T-bucket, and the hot rod boys for the street, the trailing arms for the rear wheels. He literally just put that rod end into the piece of tubing and welded it into the piece of tubing, which of course broke off. He said, Jack, what do you do? I said, well, you make a threaded area on your tubing and you wind them in. That's what these are for. Oh, the days of hot rodders. What else is of interest here, immediate interest? As we covered the oil pump. These rods...
Actually, no, we have to do that one again. So the oil pump, we have to do that one again.
on a wet sump engine, everybody used the stock oil pumps for years before Mellings and other people got into making high quality. Come on, which way did it go? To the ground, of course. Oh, it's way down there. I don't bend as good as I used to. But that's a stock GM oil pump. It's mounted with these two bolts here. The shaft goes up and is driven by the cab. And just the physical weight of that broke it off. A stock item. No, there's no damage of the bolts or the gears locking up or anything. Just the physical weight of a ho-hum streetcar casting. So that's the kind of stuff for years and years and years that I fought, trying to figure out what to do next and make it better. Told you the one about the Aston Martin.
Yeah, that one we need to hear again.
Vic Francis had a Aston Martin 6-cylinder engine that he wanted it rebuilt. And the crankshaft main bearings in that engine are in separate little round, separate bearing housings, like an Offen housing. Big, huge bore. So each main bearing is free to turn on the crankshaft. So when you assemble the engine, you have to rotate each segment until this comes in through the side of the block into the oil gallery, which feeds the oil to the main bearing. This goes into the big round main bearing housing. Well, whoever had rebuilt the engine prior to me didn't get it into the block. Now, it doesn't say that the block was turning, but obviously it was squeezed down a little bit because he never got it in. But that was the rear bearing on the Aston Martin. No indication of a bearing problem, probably because it never did any high RPM running in the first place, and there was adequate oil. But as you assemble things, you've got to watch for various items. Assembly-wise, we want to put a new fitting on, so you take the new fitting out of the box and you put it on. Did you bother to look into the fitting? Can you see through there?
It's not drilled out. Yeah, not drilled out.
It's drilled out, but there's a piece of shrapnel in it.
Oh, there is.
That's nicely
Now I see
plated.
it.
And all that.
Now I see it. Okay.
Brand new out of the box.
Wow. Oof.
That fits that no threads on the connecting rod bolt. High quality stuff.
Yeah.
These two guys looking for lightweight. On the McLarens, the roll bar comes up off the monocoque to two little sockets on the posts, and your roll bar goes down into those sockets about that far, and these bolts go through to hold the roll bar onto the tub, which I would say is kind of marginal in strength in the first place, but they had to drill them out for weight. Isn't that grasping at straws? One of the Formula One guys says, well, you know, our goal is to make the car as light as possible so that we can add weight, ballast weight, to bring it up to the minimum weight, but putting the weight where we want it so the car is balanced better. Yeah. No. That's a no to me. The poly motor, he was going to make a all plastic motor. This was the connecting rods out of it. I got involved a little bit with that group. I'm forgetting his name, but to me it was not a poly motor. The only thing plastic on it were the two water jacket outer sides. It was done 99% on a milling machine, big plates with bores, gold fruit. So, kind of not a plastic motor. Here's an example of somebody that had an AC Bristol that had a previous accident, obviously, and the rear or the A-frame at the bottom, front suspension. Come on, you never wanted this thing. Was all nice and smooth and round. And in cleaning it all up, I'm looking and says, man, there's something not happy there. It had a major dent in it, and rather than replace the A-frame, he filled it with lead and sanded it all off so it looked like it was still nice and round. I had a friend named Stan Lobitz who raced back in the early days. He loved roundy round races and dirt tracks. And he said, back in the 30s, you know what killed most drivers? He said, no, what? He said, the mechanics. Who really didn't know what they're doing in the first place. And this is a good example of cosmetics. Function first, cosmetics second is my goal. Has always been my goal that way in performance. The BMW CSL, the dry sump on that, the lower end of it, on the front end of the engine, is the lowest point. And somehow when you have enough ground clearance, it wouldn't do that. But these are the three fittings on the dry sump system of the CSL vertical engine. And this was at Riverside. And it said it's starting to leak oil. So unfortunately there was two bounces. I said, well, do you hit bounces on the track? He says, yeah, there's two places where the car will really bottom out. Well, on each bottom out, he was getting a whoop, whoop, whoop. And little by little, both fittings were going away, getting worn down. So we had an interesting life in making parts. This is a good one too. The differential. Spider gears, ring and pinion, where this bolts onto the ring and pinion. The housing normally would be coming out here with all your internals of the gears and all. Broke all off. That broke off. And all these bolts were sheared. Another stock item going into racing. Stock parts weren't made to race. We don't have that big hub. So get the big hub.
Okay.
Okay.
While we take a little break again, we can look at the fabrication area of the shop. Jack always said all you need is a drill press, a band saw, and a belt sander. And there you go. You pretty much make just about anything that you want. I hope that the camera is not shaky. Hope my hand is steady enough. And there's Jack. All right, let's go back. Here we go.
Scott Hughes has a 1972 BMW CSL, and this is a front hub. And down in Atlanta, while he was running, he said something broke in the front end, and he said it's kind of wobbly. When I hit the brakes and all, it moves around. Apparently, BMW had known or recognized that they were having fragile items here, and they pressed in a piece of steel tubing to make it stronger. And that is right at the end of where the main bearing, this is the big bearing, that bearing carries the weight of the car. This end of it is what steers the car and takes the bounces and camber and all that. Well, that a little bit of effort, constant moving, heated it up, and that's what broke it off. On the fresh break on these 3 points, you could see the material being blue from heat, getting hotter and hotter and breaking off. The tube should have been longer, getting past that point of where it bends. So I took these 2 pieces to our local machine shop that was qualified to repair aircraft items, and hands them these 2 pieces. Says, "Can you make me 2 of these?" And one, he made 3 by reverse engineering, measuring and making them. He made one that doesn't have any threads here, because sometimes if you need the next one to be right-hand thread or left-hand thread. And I said, when you make the hole there, make it about 3/8 of an inch. Give it the strength it needs. Fatigue, metal fatigues. It's as simple as that. And it's hard to understand how something that big and heavy could have broken. Yeah, I'll get it right. That's when you could say you had a good strong cylinder head, because he tried like hell to push that piston up through the head. Big block Chevy again. Oh dear. Broken parts and broken hearts. The opposite of technology or driver control, when we had Tony Adamowicz driving the McLaren, and we were at Laguna Seca, and when an early practice session, he ran a couple laps and came in, he said there was a little vibration and I hit the master switch. Well, the vibration was caused by the crankshaft being in 2 pieces. The crank had broken between one of the main journal, and when I took it apart, the bearings on each side were not scored. So there's a mechanic or a driver that wasn't good, and immediately shut the engine off. Compared to the guy that cuts an oil pan in half. So there are a million stories like that, and this is an attempt, our first attempt at following that idea of making a little book on broken parts and broken hearts. But I would like to talk to a lot more mechanics who can have stories like that of whatever they were taking care of over the years. The old daddy, the old IndyCar guy, Granatelli, his turbine car, a $10 bearing. It's the little things that kill you. There's an example there of the wrist pin. It did crack. So it was developing a little hard knocking that he heard. Kemper Miller driving at Daytona, or Road Atlanta. So luckily it was stopped before it was a major blow up. But there was a lot of spline failures from the shafts not being strong enough to transmit power. And it's so obvious about all of that splining was in the clutch. So that's why there's no bending in here. And then there was that much before it flared out to the stock size of the output shaft. So that's the area you were playing with when, let's see, what was the story there? A similar story with our GTP car at Miami, where he says, I have nothing. I put it in any gear in a Sunday morning practice session, warm-up session. And I says, well, it has to be the input shaft, which did have a history of failing. So while he told one of my crew members, get down to the March parts truck, and I said, I want the new input shaft with the bearing housing on it, the bearing in it, ready to go into the tranny. We pulled the entire rear end off the car, got to the point, clutch off and all that, to find a similar part, and luckily it broke off right at the transmission face, that with a magnet I pulled it out and got it out, the broken part, put the new one in, and all this was happening as Roger Bailey, the tech inspector and crew from IMSA, was watching. And they're saying he's from March Engineering. I can't believe it, but they actually are getting that job done in an hour and a half or so. If we can hold up the race, so the Miami race on TV was held up about 5 minutes for start to get our Red Lobster car on the grid. Input shaft change in that amount of time when you know what you're doing. And the luck was it broke in the right spot and the magnet pulled it out. And that was the only failure, the shaft itself.
Wow.
The more I get into this, the more stories I remember. It's an interesting thought, a little book like that. So we're going to be working on that. That's a Hewland output shaft out of a transaxle, and they obviously didn't have the strength either. I'm not a total believer in the diameter cutting. Most of it happens at the end of the splines where they're tapering off to that diameter. That's the weak point. I like to diagnose an autopsy.
Well, that Cobra's certainly giving you a lot of headaches.
Scott Hughes says, I don't like the word autopsy. When you say, well, I want to leave it alone, and as I take it apart, I want to see and why, what possibly caused the problem. Paul Miller got involved with a problem of high intensity with Porsche. I think it was a Porsche car.
Camaro?
No. Well, it had to be this is the 924, had a front engine, 4-cylinder.
Yes.
Okay, he had that from the factory. And mechanics, being who we are, we're curious as to why did the engine stop? So while we were changing, part of the crew was changing and putting the other motor in, the inquisitive ones, let's see what blew. So we pulled the oil pan off to see what it might have been. That particular motor, the oil pan was the bottom, one big casting for your lower main bearings, and the bolt that holds that was a rod that went up through the block, and it was also held pulling the head on. So it was a squeeze together. Later on, we found out that the motors were factory supplied, and they didn't have the opportunity at that point to do the autopsy. They were very, very, very upset that we had taken it apart. And they really bitched at Paul. He was in trouble over it. He said, well, how did we know? It's just the curiosity of mechanics.
Hmm?
Yeah, he was in deep. They were going to pull his dealership.
Wow. Unbelievable.
It's the same with the turbo Porsches of Can-Am. You did not own the motors. They were all a lease. You pull the motor, send it back to the factory. They send you another one.
You ran a Porsche. You ran a Porsche motor in one of the marches, correct?
Well, the 82 March, because of winning the championship with the M1, BMW provided us with 2 motors. And March was building 4 GTP cars in 82, and they agreed, with their connections with BMW, they agreed that they'd build one for our car, the BMW. So the first time we ran the car, it had the BMW M16 engine in it. Our hope was that it would get better fuel economy and have the endurance that way, but we couldn't throw away 200 horsepower of the Chevy V8s. So at the end of that season, Kemper and David and the Red Lobster boys, what are we going to do for next year? And Kemper and I said, well, March has all the parts to put a Chevy engine in it. And Red Lobster and David says, then we're in with the regular Chevy guys and the black leather jackets and all that. And we enjoyed having all the Porsche people that come into Red Lobster restaurants. So we'd rather have something better. So we decided we'd do the turbo Porsche motor. And Clem down at Fabcar in Atlanta did 90% of the engineering and building and this and that. We got the transaxle from Porsche, and he made the adapters, and all the things that we were doing down there to get it ready to run, March was doing as well, but they were way behind schedule. So to get at the beginning of the season, they gave Al Holbert a new March with a Chevy in it for him to be on the track. In the meantime, we were building it up, and everything we asked about, oh no, you can't put the air cooler or the intercooler there because it'll affect the flow of air. You can't do this, you couldn't do that. So we pursued it, and we still had the car ready for the Daytona 24-hour, but we knew we were going to blow out the intercooler seals. So that went down the tube. Sebring was the next one, and we got that running for Sebring. And at one of the practice events, Kemper called in and he says, there's a vibration in the motor that comes and goes. Every time I step on a clutch, it's a different vibration. Sometimes it's not there at all. So I said, well, the only thing that's happening back there at that point in time would be the clutch discs themselves going off center momentarily as you release at the RPM. So I pulled the transaxle out, and the transaxle being made to be adapted to various widths of bell housings had a coupling in the middle with output shafts that you could put different ends in for different lengths. And we were at Sebring, the bracket that held it, the clip, I said, there's enough metal there, so I went to the machine shop locally and just made the bolt holes into ovals so I could move the coupler out further, because the shaft was not getting into the crankshaft. It was getting into the dust seal of the bearing, but not into the crankshaft. Once it was in, everything went away. 3 races later, a guy comes over to me in the pits. He says, Jack, when you were commenting about something's wrong, this and that with the Porsche, and the immediate reaction to them was, oh, Mr. Deren, don't you know how many months and time we put in research? If there's something wrong, you must have done something wrong. But he came in and he says, Jack, you were right. The thraft was not getting into the engine, but they didn't want to tell anybody. So it wasn't until the 5th race of the season, I think, where Holbert finally came out with the March Porsche powered car. So in the meantime, we were being sabotaged by Porsche. No, you can't do this, you can't do that. They didn't want a privateer to be the first one on the grid with a Porsche powered. But again, we didn't have the testing programs, we didn't have the drivers of the time. So it was never a winning car. The best performance we had was a second at Charlotte. But it was interesting years of doing what we did. Same with the M1. When he got the M1 at the end of '79 series, it was an ex-pro car, and they ran it in 4 races in that year of '80 because it was put in with the GTX group, I think, the turbo Porsche 935s. And the best we ever did was a 4th place finish with that, because it was obviously underpowered. So over the winter, I attacked it with my IMSA rules, which were a lot more flexible than FIA rules. And I did what I felt we needed to do. And when we turned up at the 24-hour inspection for the next race in '81, 10 of the other M1s that were there protested to John Bishop that about the illegality of my car. And John was there, and I saw him call those people over, and he said, understand something. This Daytona 24-hour race is an IMSA race that we invited you to come over to. The car that Red Lobster has there is a legal IMSA car. And that's the car we won the championship with that year. So whatever minor things we did, and the driver having the confidence to really use it, 9 or 11 races in a row we won. The one we didn't, where we came in second, was at Sonoma. Very, very hot weekend, dry as a bone, a lot of dust. On the last lap, Dennis Aussie was chasing David Cowart, and somebody out in front of David got off the track and set up an absolutely opaque cloud of dust. You could zero visibility. David, of course, gets off the gas a little bit and moves carefully through the cloud of dust, gets back on the gas to go over the finish line in second. I said, "Wow, what happened?" Well, Dennis Aussie passed us on that halfway through the last lap. And we went over to Dennis a little later after we got settled in the pits. He said, "Boy, that was a gutsy move to fly into that cloud of dust." And Dennis looked at us and says, "What cloud?" He says, "I was totally exhausted from the heat of the weekend. He says, my last 3 or 4 laps were strictly on instinct and rhythm. I had no idea about anything but the rhythm of the track and how he went through that cloud of dust like it wasn't there."
Wow. Incredible.
Peter Gregg used to put out a $10,000 award to people that would challenge him, but nobody ever did. He says, "But let me take as many laps as I want on an open track, no other cars around." And he said, "I'll do a lap around Daytona with a blindfold on." Because you get in that rhythm of listening to the car, you know where you are, what gear you're in. Oh, there's a turn coming, and you make the turn. But nobody had ever took him up on it. But I believe he could do it.
Peter Perfect.
Peter Perfect, yep. Lots of good stories. It's How are you feeling, Joe?
I'm good.
Yeah, you're just standing there holding a camera.
No. I know, but
If we do that, I think we should do it again eventually, but a little more information about the various pieces and parts and why they fail. There's so little failures nowadays. The technology has really caught up with racing. And everything's done by the CNC machine.
very little tolerances and
It's amazing those machines can do that.
oh yeah. Well, you know, just punch it into the computer and that's it. It's done. You know, whereas with a manual machine, you know, it could be a Monday or a Friday, and yeah, it's like, oh, I want to get out of here, or you know,
A friend of ours from here in Carbondale worked for Hendrix, and he brought me up a photo one time of the engine crew standing behind 40 motors laying in front of them. And they said, well, what's all this? He says, well, they're for the 4 teams that we provide motors for the Daytona 500. And they're all dynoed, ready to install. 40 motors. Now, how do you say I'm going to go out and race against that kind of operation?
and back in the, you know, let's say the 50s and 60s, they had one car and an open trailer, and that was pretty much it.
Yeah.
If you crashed, you were out. That was it. You know, they didn't have 2, 3, 4 cars.
Well, the McLaren Bruce and Denny show, the 82B cars, the Mark, they appeared at Can-Am races with 3 trailers, one for each car, and a third one for bodywork and other parts and pieces on open trailers.
Yeah.
But Can-Am was the last of real racing.
Yeah.
They knew if they're there to win the race, they have to be on the track. There was no time for a pit stop. If you had to pull in for any pit stop, you'd never make up the time on the track. So you had to build a car that your confidence would last at least the 200 miles of length for whatever track they were on. When it reached 200 miles, the checker flag went out. And they ran that kind of events and won. One time I was standing there looking at the car, kneeling down with Jim Hall, looking at the McLarens. The body was off, and he's looking at the suspension and all. And he says, what's the trick, Jim? Why are these guys doing so well? He says, well, these are very unremarkable cars. There's nothing whatsoever trick about them being driven remarkably well. My early days of learning. I asked him, well, what do you do? What's your pursuit in adding and getting a car ready? And he says, well, when you're going through the S's, the transverse between a right, a left, a right, a left, to get it as docile and quickly and agile as possible, you want to get whatever weight of the car as close to the center of gravity as possible. He says, picture a dumbbell for lifting weights. You grab the handle, it's a 10-pound, and there's a ball here and a ball there. And try rotating it like that against holding one ball and rotating. It's easier. So that was one of the biggest moves I did with our M1. Anything I could move inside the wheelbase. Cut out all the extraneous weight hanging out over the wheels and all. That was the major thing I did with those cars. And being designed for high touring miles, 100,000 miles for a touring car, they basically took the rubber bushings out and put heim joints in all the bushings, which made changing wheel alignment a real chore. So I made a few changes in the wheel alignment structure of how to adjust it. I could change the rear end tow in or tow out in a matter of 10 minutes or so. On a stock M1, it might take you a couple hours.
Wow.
Little things like that to me, or in endurance and sports car racing, is accessibility. Because over the wall is only 2 mechanics. You've got to fix it there, now, not back in the garage, and have a crew of 30 people and all that to work with. Has to be done in the pit.
Yep. Yep. Well.
This could probably go on for ages.
It can.
My alleged mind gets different memories.
Well, you talk about, the cars that you modified just for more accessibility or weight transfer. The first thing that popped into my head was Paul Miller's Camaro with the battery, and the placement of where you put it.
Yeah. John Tamanis was the tech inspector, and when you open the driver's door, there was a battery staring at you. And he said, well, you can't have the battery in the passenger compartment. I says, it isn't. It's in the door. The passenger compartment's on the other side of the roll cage. He just shook his head. He says, well, when the door closes, it covers it into its own little box.
There you go.
There you go. I was even looking at a possibility of running a jack shaft off the front of the motor back into the compartment so that on the passenger's floor, you'd have the fuel pump, the oil pump, the scavenge pumps, everything there, accessible to work on. And
Wow.
And I said, nah, that would be pushing the issue too deep.
Yeah. Well, it makes me think of all the stuff that you did on my CSL with access and panels and things just from the original CSLs.
The car that Kemper Miller owned was the next factory car of 75 when the factory brought 4 of them over. In 76, that was their end of BMW's involvement, and it was the car to beat the Porsches of the day, and Peter Gregg wanted to move out of the Porsche and get into the BMW CSL. So he says, how much did he want for him? He said, well, we have over $5 million in the building of these things. How do we put a price on a part of the structure? So our program is over. So they gave the cars to Peter at a very good price and tons of parts. So Peter ran it in 76. And Kemper bought it. In 76, we were doing a Pantera. And the new rules for next year would not allow that to be a American car. So it was built in Italy. It's not an American. So you couldn't put a bigger motor in it like the Corvettes were getting. So Kemper decided, well, the BMW is the winning car. Let's get one from Greg. Greg asked Kemper, well, who's going to work on it? I said, well, it'll be Jack. A bolt's a bolt, a nut's a nut. We'll figure it out. And Peter said, he's a Chevy mechanic. So anyhow, over the winter, I tore the whole car down, and anywhere I found cracks, I repaired and added the strength of the roll cage. See, FIA, the roll cage is for driver protection. It is not allowed to be adding construction strength to the chassis of the car. IMSA allowed you to attach the roll cage to body structure. So obviously it goes up the door posts, across the windshield, and wherever there was a problem with the tubing, I said, well, why is it moving? Why is it cracked? And reinforced it. In 77, when Kemper ran it, many fastest laps of the day, fastest track records, pole positions for the class. And years later, the car was, after we bought the M1 and all that, a friend bought the CSL, and it was invited down to Daytona pre-race for the 24-hour of anything that won or ran down at Daytona. So we took it down there, and for the history of the 24-minute event, they had Brian Redmond drive it. And I told Brian, I said, the engine, I have no idea the time frame on it. It could have 5 hours, it could have 40 hours. I have no idea. And being an M49 motor, we don't want to have it scattered, so treat it with some care. And of course, the green flag drops and the bullshit stops. And on the first lap of that touring, I think they were going to run 6 laps or 5 laps. But on the first lap, a GT40 and a CSL went blasting by, and the rest of the pack was a good 200-300 yards back. So it ran the event. He pulls into the car, into the pits, and the first words out of Brian's mouth is, "Jack, this runs a hell of a lot better than the factory car." FIA doesn't want you to build real race cars. They want the car, if you want to be a race car, you got to build it. You don't modify it to be a race car. And right now, that is why Paul Miller is driving a BMW. He got rid of the Lamborghinis that he was running because he couldn't catch up with the factory cars. And little by little, he had enough rapport with some of the mechanics. So, well, I'm trying like hell. I think we have everything we could have. I just can't seem to catch them on the track. So the mechanic says, give me a few minutes. And he went in and pulled the computer and made a few changes in the computer. And he went out. And isn't it amazing how the car runs much faster now? He found out that the race structure of the Lamborghini was 200 horsepower less that you could get in your street one that you buy at a dealership. It was restricted to that degree.
Wow.
So that's when he said, "The hell with this. I can't go on with that."
Yeah. Wow.
You can't fight the factories.
No. No.
So he convinced BMW to build him that Z4 or whatever they are now.
Yeah, the M4.
M4.
Yeah. Yeah.
So he is now running with IMSA with a BMW.
Well, let's take a break.
And he won at Lime Rock.
Yeah, he did. Yeah. Yeah, he totally did. Hey, Sarah.
Did my gal come in?